Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. As Charlie said, I'm Ellie, and I'm part of the congregation here at Bessels. And I am going to be carrying on our series, Announcing the Kingdom, the Gospel of Matthew. And this week, we are looking at the very last section of the Sermon on the Mount, as Ian just read to us. So I don't know about anyone else, but growing up, I went camping. I'm sure most of us have done that at some point. You know, the experience of getting wet and trying to dry out inside a very wet tent, possibly having an argument with whoever, whoever is with us about the correct way to set up the tent. And of course, you are always the correct one. Well, when I did camping when I was younger, it was when I was a teenager. And at the time, we lived in Dubai. So it was a little bit different, because when you go camping in Dubai, you go to the middle of the desert. But when you tell people that you're going camping in Dubai for the first time, the one thing you will hear multiple times is the rule, never camp in a wadi. Now this is what a wadi looks like. Wadi simply means dried riverbed in the local languages. And it's one of those things that you look at this and you go, why wouldn't I want to camp there? There's a nice stream, there's protection from the rock walls, there's greenery, it's normally quite flat, they're beautiful places. Why would I not want to camp there? It seems like a stupid rule. This is the same wadi on a different day. And this is what the locals refer to as a wild wadi, which is when they flood. And they are immensely powerful. They flood at a speed of about 6 miles an hour. And because of the way the world is in the Middle East, it does not have to have rained on you for the river to flood, because the floods come down from the mountains. So the first thing you know about it when the wadi you are in is flooding is a wall of water heading towards you. They are amazing, and they are life-threatening, and they do take lives. Now, the rule, don't camp in a wadi, seems like a rather sensible one. So today we're looking at true obedience. And I don't mean sit, stay, and roll over. Thanks, Jess, for the dogs earlier. Really fits. We are talking about the rules and the lifestyle that we follow as Christians, sometimes without understanding why it's in our best interest. So why should we listen to Jesus' teachings? We're going to start off with the very last verse that we heard from Ian today. And it says, "And now, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowd were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes." So the people that are being referred to are the ones that have just listened to the Sermon on the Mount. The thing that we've been looking at since February, they've had in one sitting, and Jesus has taken rules and prophecies that they would have known for generations, and he has exploded them. He has changed them. He has built on them in ways that would have been considered unbelievable. For us, it seems really natural. The Sermon on the Mount has always been part of our Christian faith. But for these people, this is going against what they grew up knowing. It is extremely radical, and it is actually countercultural. Jesus is talking about things that go against what other leaders are saying. And unlike other teachers, he is not in-text referencing every 5 minutes. If you've done a degree, referencing is very important. And Jesus doesn't have to do that because he knows the truth, and he brings the truth of God to these people. So let's have a quick skim through over what we've looked at so far, what we've looked at during the Sermon on the Mount. So Andy kicked us off in February with the Beatitudes, with the blessings that Jesus gave to those people considered less by society. We looked at how Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. We've looked at how we are called to be salt and light in this world. We have looked at really difficult topics like murder and reconciliation. Jesus' really, really radical changes in the treatment of women at his time in history. We've looked at loving our enemies, which seems so hard, how we can be the best Christians, how we can be pious without gloating. We've looked at how to pray, fasting. We've looked at what Jesus thinks about worrying, on judgment of others, prayers, and how to choose the path for your life. And this sermon wraps up with true obedience. So if we go to the first verse of the passage, it says, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on rock." What is the rock? Wrong rock. Try that one instead. How do we as Christians build our lives on a rock if we don't know what the rock is? Let's look back at the passage and see where the rock is coming from. "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand." The rock is the hearing and the doing, the teachings of Jesus. The "and" is the important part. It's not "or," it's not "you listen or you do," it's not an optional. They come together. The theologian and Franciscan Richard Rohr set up the Centre for Action and Contemplation as an answer to this duality of faith. And he says, "Without contemplation, all our doing, it comes from ego. Even if it looks selfless, and it can cause more harm than good. External behavior must be connected to and supported by spiritual guidance. It doesn't matter which comes first. Action may lead you to contemplation, and contemplation may lead you to action." Rohr believes that action and contemplation are circular, that prayer and contemplation leads us to our actions, and our actions should lead us back to contemplation. It is an integrated Christian life. And I believe this is where the rock that Jesus is talking about comes from, the integration of Christian living. But what does that look like? So here are four elements of integrated living: hearing, contemplation and prayer, living and doing. We can do each element on their own, but only when we do them all together do we have a truly integrated life. If you hear on a Sunday morning and walk out the door and forget, how are you meant to contemplate and live those things? If you ponder and pray deeply on the profoundness of life, but you ignore the calling that that pondering brings, are you living your Christian truth? If you do actions not because of your Christian values, but for the want of gratification of others, from others, isn't that just ego, like Rohr talks about? And if we live our Christian values, but we are stagnant and we are not willing to learn, how do we grow as Christians? If you remove one element from this cycle, it falls apart. Integrated living is about balance. You can't pour out if you're not filling up. If you're not filling up, you're leading to Christian burnout. But at the same time, if we do, and if we listen but don't do, how are we being salt and light in our communities? So the rock is integration. The rock is Jesus' teachings underpinning not just our church life, but every action and interaction we have. So we've now looked at the rock. What about the sand? And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. Now, when I think about sand, I think of two fundamentals. One, if you intentionally try to move sand, it's really hard. Trying to lift sand in your hands is difficult. It runs through your fingers. You cannot move it. It is one of those things that's really annoying to shift. But the other element of sand is when you have no intention of moving it, you will do so very easily. I'm sure we've all had the experience of going to the beach or to a sand pit and coming home with sand in shoes, in picnic baskets, in cars, way more than we ever thought we could possibly pick up and bring home, and it's there for months. So sand is both difficult to move and easy. So if we head back to our beach, I'm sure pretty much everyone here has built a sandcastle at some point in their life. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. They're great. Do you put time and energy into building a sandcastle? You make it the biggest and the best sandcastle you can. You decorate it. You make it look perfect. And when you walk away, if you come back later that day or the next day, it's gone. It's not gone because that was your intention. It's not gone because you didn't work hard enough. It's gone because that is the chaos of sand. Water and sand always want to return to chaos, no matter how hard we try to stop them. So, like sandcastles, we put effort into building houses. And in this passage, both of the houses look good. They look good from the outside. They look nice. They look the same. But it's not what's out on the outside that counts. Now, nobody, in my experience, sets out to build a purposefully bad house. I do not believe that this passage is talking about a foolish man who purposefully decided that he was going to turn from the truth to spite God and Jesus. I believe that foolishness comes from a lack of knowledge and understanding of our consequences. And unfortunately, in February, we had a very real visualization of this with the Turkey and Syria earthquakes. Now, the building inspectors who took bribes to build what they probably thought were adequate buildings that didn't need all of the extra stuff that they were meant to have in them was going to be okay. They looked fine, they worked as buildings, and they got extra money. I don't believe they thought that their choice would result in death. But that's exactly what happened when the earthquake hit. There is a science fiction writer called Robert A. Heinlein, and there is a quote from him. This quote there's a very similar one that comes from slightly later, but I'm using this one today. You have attributed conditions to villainy that are simply the result of stupidity. I'll read that again. You have attributed conditions to villainy that are simply the result of stupidity. How often do we do that? Do we assume intentional hurt and harm from somebody or something when actually it's just a lack of thought or a lack of knowledge and understanding that causes that pain? During the pandemic, we as a nation were offered the choice as to whether to have a COVID vaccination. There was no sign around people's necks saying, I have or have not had this. You could not tell when you're walking down the road who was and who was not vaccinated. Everyone looked the same. The only time you could tell was when people caught the virus, and people who were unvaccinated ended up in hospital in far greater numbers. And I remember hearing stories of doctors who had patients pleading with them for a vaccination, and the doctors having to say it was too late. Once you caught it, the vaccination was no help to you. These people didn't choose to not get vaccinated because they wanted to make themselves really ill. They didn't choose to end up in hospital. They didn't understand the consequences of the choice they were making. They weren't informed. And just like COVID for most people, the unmissable fact in this passage is the storm comes to both houses. The rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on rock. The rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Jesus never tells us that Christianity is a safety bubble. He never tells us that life is going to be easier because we're Christians. In fact, he tells us that life is still going to be tough, possibly tougher. The storm comes to both. The only difference is the outcome. So, storms come to all of us in our lives, in different ways and at different times. You can't build in a storm. You can't lay foundations when all of your energy is going to just holding on as you're being battered and blown around. If this is you today, if you are in the middle of a storm, if you are just clinging on, my prayer is that you reach out to somebody you trust, somebody here at Bessels, because we want to support you through that storm. We are a community, and communities can be strong in storms where individuals are struggling. So what if you're not in a storm at the moment? We've seen what integrated Christian living can look like and can be. We've seen the chaos of sand and the blind spots we all have and lack of knowledge we have in our lives and the results that can be catastrophic. But what can we do with this information? Very handily for my sermon today, a couple of years ago, my brother and his wife legitimately built a house on sand. They live in Bournemouth. They didn't realise when they started digging the foundations for their extension that it was just sand. And so when they were informed that this was the case, they had to get massive steel reinforcements and they had to dig so much further to find bedrock. It took time, it took effort, and in this case, it took money. So if you are in fair weather, maybe it's time to take stock. Where is the sand in your life? So looking at our integrated living again, does your life feel balanced and integrated? Is there an imbalance somewhere? Do you look at this and think that one element of this is pulling you away from the others? Maybe it's time to take time to contemplate and pray about faith, about your questions. Maybe you can go back and listen to the sermons that we've had since February. I've been doing that this week, and I would say that they're just as good on a second reading, second listening, if not better, and you take even more away from them. Is there something that you feel you're being called to do in your life that you haven't had the courage to do yet? Maybe this week you try to find a way of starting that ball rolling. Or maybe you don't really know how to look at your faith on your own, you're not sure where to start, and you need to dig out a yellow hard hat and find someone that's a friend that you trust to be your proverbial building inspector. Can they help you check your foundations? Because if we lay our foundations now, they can carry us through the storms of the future. And we have that rock. That is what Jesus is giving us, the opportunity to be held fast through the storm.